It was an ordinary day when my nephew, Jake, called me and asked if I could give him and his friend a ride. I've always been close to my nephew, treating him more like a younger brother than a distant family member. We'd shared countless memories, laughs, and secrets, and I never thought that he would betray me the way he did. Little did I know, that simple ride would change everything. Jake was one of those kids who always seemed to get himself into situations nothing too serious, just the usual teenage troubles. But I always thought he had a good heart. That's why when he asked me for the favor, I didn't think twice. I agreed without hesitation. He mentioned something about needing to go to his friend's place to pick something up, and then head to another destination. Again, nothing out of the ordinary. It seemed like a routine favor that any uncle would do. When I pulled up to Jake's house, I saw him waiting outside with his friend, who I didn't know very well. His friend Nate was about Jake's age, a little taller and broader with a quiet demeanor. I'd met him a few times before in passing, but nothing more than a quick hello or a nod. He seemed harmless enough, though there was always something about him that made me slightly uneasy, a vibe that I couldn't quite place. Jake and Nate climbed into the back seat, chatting quietly between themselves. As I started driving, I could hear them whispering, and I figured they were just discussing whatever teenage boys talk about. I didn't pay much attention, focusing instead on the road. The first part of the drive was uneventful. They talked amongst themselves, I drove, and everything seemed normal. But as we reached a more secluded part of the road, things took an unexpected turn. Jake leaned forward from the back seat, tapping me on the shoulder. "Hey, Uncle, mind if we make a quick stop before heading to Nate's place?" he asked. "There's something we need to take care of. It won't take long." "Sure, no problem," I said, still unsuspecting of what was about to unfold. I trusted Jake completely. Why wouldn't I? He was family, someone I had helped raise. I would never have imagined what was coming. As we drove down a road that I wasn't familiar with, the atmosphere in the car shifted. The once casual chatter between Jake and Nate faded, and an unsettling silence fell over us. I glanced at them through the rearview mirror, and they were both staring straight ahead, their faces unreadable. A chill ran down my spine, but I pushed it aside, convincing myself that I was just overthinking things. Suddenly, Nate reached forward and grabbed my arm, his grip strong and unyielding. "Pull over," he demanded, his voice calm but with an underlying edge that made my heart race. "What the hell are you doing?" I asked, confused and alarmed. My instinct was to resist, but something in Nate's eyes told me that wasn't a good idea. Jake, my own nephew, sat there silently, his expression blank, not offering me any help or explanation. "Just pull over," Nate repeated, tightening his grip. His calm demeanor was even more terrifying than if he had yelled or threatened me. Against my better judgment, I did as he asked, pulling the car over to the side of the road. We were in the middle of nowhere, with no houses or people in sight. My mind raced, trying to make sense of what was happening. This wasn't like Jake. What had gotten into him? And why was Nate acting like this? Once the car was stopped, Nate released my arm and leaned back in his seat, as if nothing had happened. But the tension in the air was palpable, thick enough to cut with a knife. I turned around to face them, my heart pounding in my chest. "What's going on?" I demanded, looking directly at Jake, hoping he would say something, anything to make sense of the situation. But he just stared back at me, his eyes cold and distant, like he wasn't even the same person I had known all these years. "You'll find out soon enough," Nate said, his voice dripping with arrogance. He exchanged a glance with Jake, and in that moment, I realized that whatever was happening, Jake was fully complicit. The sense of betrayal hit me like a punch to the gut. My own nephew, someone I had trusted with everything, was involved in whatever twisted game was being played. I didn't know if it was fear, anger, or a combination of both that surged through me, but I knew I had to stay calm. Panicking wouldn't help, and I needed to figure out a way to get out of this situation. As I sat there, gripping the steering wheel, my mind raced through all the possible scenarios. Were they planning to rob me? Hurt me? Worse? Every possibility seemed more terrifying than the last. I kept glancing at Jake, hoping he would snap out of whatever hold Nate had on him, but he remained silent, his face emotionless. "Look," I said, trying to keep my voice steady, "whatever this is, let's just stop it now. You don't have to do this." I directed my words at Jake, hoping to appeal to whatever was left of the boy I had known, the boy who used to come to me for advice, who I had watched grow up. But Jake didn't respond. Nate, however, chuckled softly, a sound that sent a shiver down my spine. "It's too late for that," he said, his eyes glinting with malice. "Just do as we say, and you'll get through this in one piece." Before I could react, Jake reached into his bag and pulled out a piece of rope. My stomach dropped. This was worse than I had thought. Whatever they were planning, it wasn't going to end well for me. "Jake, don't do this," I pleaded, my voice shaking now. "You don't have to listen to him." But Jake ignored me, handing the rope to Nate. They both got out of the car, and within seconds, Nate was pulling me out of the driver's seat and forcing me to the ground. I tried to fight back, but Nate was stronger than I had anticipated, and Jake didn't lift a finger to help me. Instead, he just stood there, watching as his friend tied my hands behind my back. The betrayal burned deep inside me. This was my nephew, someone I had loved and cared for, and now he was standing by, letting this happen. I couldn't understand it. I didn't want to believe it, but there was no denying the reality of the situation. As they finished tying me up, Nate and Jake exchanged another glance, and for a brief moment, I thought I saw a flicker of doubt cross Jake's face, but it was gone as quickly as it had appeared, replaced by the same cold indifference that had been there before. Nate leaned down close to my ear, his breath hot against my skin. "Now, you're going to do exactly what we say. Got it?" I didn't respond. I couldn't. My mind was still trying to process everything that had just happened, the betrayal, the fear, the confusion. I had no idea what they wanted from me, or how far they were willing to go, but I knew I had to find a way out of this. I couldn't let them win. Just as I was about to speak, Nate's phone buzzed. He glanced at the screen, then looked at Jake. "Change of plans," he muttered. "We'll finish this later." Without another word, they both climbed back into the car, leaving me tied up on the side of the road. I watched as they drove away, the sound of the engine fading into the distance, leaving me alone with my thoughts and the overwhelming sense of betrayal. I had no idea what had just happened, but one thing was clear: my nephew, the boy I had loved like a son, had just turned against me, and I didn't know why. If you like this story, comment your opinion in the comment section. Make sure to hit the subscribe button to stay updated with more stories like this one. Hours passed before I was able to free myself from the restraints. My body ached, and my mind was still reeling from the shock of it all. As I stumbled back to the road, I couldn't stop thinking about Jake, about the boy I had known and the man he had become. What could have driven him to do something like this? And more importantly, what was he planning to do next? I didn't have the answers, but I knew one thing for certain: this wasn't over. Whatever they had planned, I was going to find out, and I was going to make sure they paid for what they had done to me. Days turned into weeks, and I couldn't shake the feeling of dread that followed me everywhere I went. Jake hadn't reached out to me since that day, and I hadn't gone to the police, too ashamed to admit what had happened. How could I explain that my own nephew had betrayed me, had tied me up and left me on the side of the road? No one would believe me. I started doing some digging of my own, trying to figure out what had led Jake and Nate down such a dark path. I went through Jake's social media, his old messages, anything that might give me a clue. That's when I stumbled across a Reddit post that sent chills down my spine. It was written by someone with the username J_Nate, and the details of the post matched up eerily with what had happened to me. The post described a plan to teach someone a lesson and included specific references to being tied up and left in a remote area. My blood ran cold as I read through the comments, where other users encouraged the behavior, offering tips on how to avoid getting caught and how to make the victim pay. Jake and Nate had planned this. They had posted about it online, turning my nightmare into some sick game for others to enjoy. The sense of betrayal deepened, and my anger grew. This wasn't just about what they had done to me, it was about the fact that they had made it into a public spectacle, a joke for strangers on the internet. but I wasn't going to let them get away with it. I started tracking down the other users who had commented on the post, trying to piece together who they were and how they were involved. It was slow going, but eventually I found out that Nate had been part of an online group that reveled in these kinds of twisted pranks, targeting people they knew and turning their lives upside down for fun. It wasn't just about me anymore. They had done this to others, and they would keep doing it unless someone stopped them. But the deeper I dug, the more I realized how far this went. Nate wasn't just some random kid with a bad influence. He was the ringleader of this group, orchestrating these betrayals and humiliations for his own sick pleasure. And Jake, my nephew, had fallen under his spell, becoming just another pawn in Nate's game. I couldn't sit by and let this continue. I had to confront them, had to put a stop to it once and for all. If you like this story, comment your opinion in the comment section. Don't forget to subscribe to my channel for more stories of betrayal and redemption. Stay tuned for what happens next. When I finally tracked down Jake, it wasn't easy to face him. The boy I had once known was gone, replaced by someone I didn't recognize, someone who had been twisted by Nate's influence. But I had to try, had to see if there was any part of the old Jake left. "What happened to you?" I asked, my voice thick with emotion as we sat across from each other at a local diner. "Why did you do it?" Jake didn't meet my eyes. Instead, he stared down at his coffee, his hands trembling slightly. For a moment, I thought he might apologize, might tell me that it had all been a mistake. But then he looked up, and the coldness in his eyes was unmistakable. "I did what I had to do," he said flatly. "You wouldn't understand." "I wouldn't understand," I repeated, my voice rising in disbelief. "You tied me up. Jake, you betrayed me. I'm your family." "Family doesn't mean anything anymore," he muttered, his jaw clenched. "Not when people like Nate are around." And that was when I realized that Jake was too far gone. Whatever influence Nate had over him, it had taken root deep inside him, changing him in ways I couldn't fix. I felt a sharp pang in my chest, a mixture of sadness and frustration that I couldn't shake. The boy I had watched grow up, the nephew I had helped guide, was sitting in front of me as a stranger, but I wasn't ready to give up on him. Not yet. "Jake, listen to yourself," I pleaded, trying to keep my voice steady despite the storm of emotions swirling inside me. "You're not this person. You're better than this. I know you are. Don't let Nate drag you down any further." For a moment, I thought I saw a flicker of something in his eyes, a crack in the cold facade, but just as quickly, it was gone, replaced by that same impenetrable wall. He shook his head, standing up from the table, as if to signal the end of the conversation. "It's too late for that, Uncle. Things have changed," he said, his voice low. "I've changed. I'm not that kid anymore, and you need to stay out of it, for your own good." I watched as he turned and walked out of the diner, leaving me sitting there alone, grappling with the weight of his words. It felt like I had lost him completely. The Jake I knew was buried beneath layers of anger, fear, and whatever hold Nate had on him. But deep down, I knew I couldn't just walk away. This wasn't over. It couldn't be. If you like this story, don't forget to comment your thoughts below and subscribe to the channel for more stories like this. The days that followed were a blur of restless nights and constant anxiety. I couldn't get Jake's words out of my head. "I've changed. I'm not that kid anymore." It was as if I was mourning the loss of someone still alive, someone I loved but couldn't reach anymore. I spent hours scrolling through Reddit, reading post after post in the same group that Jake and Nate had been part of. The things they discussed were horrifying: betrayal, deceit, and psychological games, all under the guise of entertainment. I couldn't wrap my head around how people could find pleasure in the suffering of others, especially those they called friends or family. What scared me most was how many people were involved. There were dozens, if not hundreds, of users commenting, sharing their own stories of manipulation and revenge. It was a toxic community feeding on cruelty and betrayal, and Jake had fallen right into it. But there was one user in particular that stood out. Someone named Silent Leader. They were the one who started most of the threads, and their comments were always the most sinister, the most manipulative. They had a way of drawing people in, making them feel like they had no choice but to follow through with whatever twisted plan they were discussing. It didn't take me long to realize that silent leader was Nate. He wasn't just another participant in this sick game, he was the mastermind. And if I was going to save Jake, I had to take down Nate. I wasn't sure how to do it. I wasn't exactly a hacker, and I had no idea how to expose Nate for who he really was. But I wasn't going to let that stop me. I started by gathering as much information as I could. I saved every post, every comment, every message I could find that linked Jake and Nate to these cruel acts. It wasn't much, but it was a start. I considered going to the police, but what could I tell them? Hey, my nephew and his friend are part of an online group that ties people up and plays twisted games with their lives. It sounded ridiculous, even to me. I needed something concrete, something that would force the authorities to take it seriously. Days turned into weeks, and I began to feel like I was drowning in the darkness of it all. Every time I found a new post, a new story from someone else who had been hurt by Nate's group, the anger inside me grew, but so did the sense of hopelessness. Nate was smart, he covered his tracks well, and the more I dug, the more it became clear that he wasn't going to be easy to take down. Then, one night, I got a message on Reddit from a user I didn't recognize, TruthSeeker42. I know what you're trying to do, the message read. We need to talk. I hesitated for a moment, unsure if this was some kind of trap, but my gut told me to respond. Who are you? I typed back. A few minutes passed before I got a response. Someone who wants to see Nate go down. He's ruined too many lives, and it's time for him to pay. I felt a rush of hope. Maybe I wasn't alone in this after all. How do I know I can trust you? I asked, still wary. You don't, they replied. But I know you're trying to save Jake, and I think I can help. I stared at the screen, my heart pounding. Whoever this person was, they knew more than I had expected, and if they were telling the truth, they might be my only chance to stop Nate. Okay, I typed. What do you have in mind? Over the next few days, I communicated with TruthSeeker42, exchanging information and building a plan. It turned out they had been part of Nate's group at one point, but had left after realizing how far things had gone. They had tried to expose Nate before, but every time they got close, Nate would find a way to discredit them or shut them down. He was smart, always one step ahead. But this time we were going to be smarter. TruthSeeker42 had access to information I never could have found on my own. They knew how to trace Nate's online activity, how to dig into his digital footprint. Slowly, we began piecing together enough evidence to expose him, not just to the authorities, but to everyone. We were going to take him down publicly, where he couldn't hide behind anonymous usernames and fake profiles. Meanwhile, I kept a close eye on Jake, trying to figure out how to reach him. I didn't want him to go down with Nate, but I knew he was in deep. The more I learned about the group, the more I realized that Jake wasn't just a pawn anymore. He was an active participant, and that broke my heart. But I wasn't going to give up on him. The plan was risky, but it was the only way. TruthSeeker42 and I gathered everything we had and prepared to release it all at once. Screenshots of Nate's posts, messages between him and other group members, evidence of the real harm he had caused to people's lives. We were going to expose him for what he really was, a manipulative sociopath who used others for his own twisted amusement. And when we did, there would be no coming back for Nate. If you like this story, don't forget to comment your thoughts below and subscribe to the channel. More intense stories of betrayal are coming soon, so stay tuned. The day we launched the plan, I could hardly sit still. My nerves were shot, my heart racing with anticipation and fear. What if Nate found out before we could expose him? What if he somehow turned it all around on us? But there was no turning back now. Within hours of releasing the evidence online, it spread like wildfire. People from all over the internet started sharing it, commenting and calling Nate out. His carefully crafted persona began to crumble, and the truth about who he really was came to light. But it wasn't just Nate who was exposed. Jake's involvement became public too, and as much as I wanted to protect him, there was no way to separate him from what he had done. He had made his choices, and now he had to face the consequences. Jake called me the next day. His voice was shaky, full of fear and regret. "Uncle, I'm sorry," he said, his words rushing out like a flood. "I didn't know it would go this far. I didn't know what Nate was really like." "I tried to warn you," I said softly, the anger I had once felt replaced by a deep sadness. "But you didn't listen." "I know," he whispered. "And now, I don't know what to do." "Jake," I said, my voice steady despite the emotions swirling inside me, "you need to make this right. It's not too late to take responsibility for what you've done, but you have to be honest. You have to face the consequences." There was a long pause on the other end of the line, and for a moment, I wasn't sure what he would say. But then he spoke, his voice barely above a whisper. "I'll try," he said. "I'll try to make it right." It wasn't the resolution I had hoped for, but it was a start. As for Nate, his days of manipulation and cruelty were over. The community he had built turned on him, and he was left with nothing but the ruins of his own making. He had destroyed so many lives, but in the end, he couldn't escape the truth. And while Jake still had a long road ahead of him, I held on to the hope that he could find his way back from the darkness. If you like this story, please share your thoughts in the comments. And don't forget to subscribe for more stories of betrayal, redemption, and the complexities of human relationships. In the aftermath of everything, I found myself reflecting on the nature of betrayal. It's not always the people you expect, not always the strangers or enemies who hurt you the most. Sometimes it's the people closest to you, the ones you trust, who can break you in ways you never saw coming. But in the end, it's also those betrayals that teach you the most about yourself and about what it means to truly forgive.